Men scrambled as planes swooped into the harbor, the whistling of bombs falling followed up by the eardrum-shattering boom of explosions. Ships instantly became engulfed in fire and smoke, listing uncomfortably in the harbor as Japanese planes buzzed overhead like a bald-faced hornet. USS Arizona's forward magazine exploded, instantly killing over 1,000 people and sending her to the bottom of Pearl Harbor, where she remains a silent memorial to this day. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Today we get into the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was a major turning point in World War II and is a huge part of American history, one that leaves a dark stain of sorrow. The Japanese launched the attack on Pearl Harbor with several major aims in mind, and we'll start there. First, they intended to destroy important American fleet units, thereby preventing the Pacific Fleet from interfering with the Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, enabling Japan to conquer Southeast Asia with no interference. The leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN as we'll abbreviate them moving forward, ascribed to Alfred Thayer Mann's decisive battle doctrine, especially that of destroying the maximum number of battleships. Second, they hoped to buy time for Japan to consolidate its position and increase its naval strength before shipbuilding authorized by the 1940 Vinson-Walsh Act erased any chance of Japanese victory. Thirdly, they wanted to deliver a striking blow to America's ability to mobilize its forces in the Pacific, so battleships were the main targets, since they were considered the prestige Navy ships at the time. As World War II continued, cruisers, destroyers, and especially aircraft carriers would prove their worth, while battleships did little other than intimidate. And finally, Japan hoped to undermine American morale to such an extent that the American government would drop its demands contrary to Japanese interests and seek a peace compromise. Obviously, they didn't know America that well. Striking the Pacific Fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor did have two distinct disadvantages for Japan. Number one, the targeted ships would be in very shallow water, so it would be relatively easy to salvage and possibly repair them, and most of the crews would survive the attack since they would be on shore leave or would be rescued from the harbor. A further important disadvantage was the utter absence of the fleet's aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga. Despite these concerns, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto decided to move forward with the plan. Japanese confidence in their ability to win a short war meant that other targets in the harbor, especially the Navy Yard, oil tank farms, and submarine base, were left untouched. This was because they thought the war would be over before the influence of these facilities would be felt. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese task force called the Striking Force, or Kido Butai, comprised of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, departed from Hirukapu Bay on Atorofu Island in the Kuriil Islands, heading to a position northwest of Hawaii. This is where they intended to launch their 408 aircraft for the attack on Pearl Harbor, 360 of which were for the 2 attack waves and 48 on Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, which is a defensive flying mission to intercept and destroy hostile aircraft before they reach their intended destination. The first wave was to be the primary attack, while the second wave was to attack carriers as its first objective and cruisers as its second, with battleships as their third target. The first wave carried most of the weapons designed to attack capital ships, mainly specially adapted Type 91 aerial torpedoes, which were designed with an anti-roll mechanism and a rudder extension that let them operate in shallow water. The air crews were ordered to select the highest value targets like aircraft carriers and battleships, or, if these were not present, any other high-value ship like cruisers and destroyers. First wave dive bombers were to attack ground targets, fighters were ordered to strafe and destroy as many parked airplanes as possible so they did not intercept bombers, especially in the first wave. When the fighters' fuel got low, they were to refuel aboard the aircraft carriers and return to Pearl Harbor. Fighters were to assume cap duties as needed, especially over American airfields. Before the attack commenced, the IJN launched reconnaissance float planes from the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Tone to scout Oahu and Lahaina Roads, Maui, with orders to report on American fleet composition and location. reconnaissance aircraft flights risked alerting Americans and were not necessary. Fleet composition and preparedness information in Pearl Harbor were already known from the reports of the Japanese spy Takeo Yoshikawa. A report of the absence of the American fleet at Lahaina, Maui, was received from Tonei's floatplane and the fleet submarine I-72. Another 4 scout planes patrolled the area between the Kido Butai and Nihao to detect counterattacks. The IJN submarines I-16, I-18, I-20, I-22, and I-24 each embarked a Type A midget submarine for transport to the waters off Oahu, and the 5 I-boats left Kure Naval District on November 25, 1941. On December 6th, they came to within 10 nautical miles of the mouth of Pearl Harbor and launched their midget subs at about 1 a.m. local time on December 7th. At 3:42 a.m. Hawaiian time, the minesweeper Condor spotted a midget submarine periscope southwest of the Pearl Harbor entrance buoy and alerted the destroyer Ward. The midget may have entered Pearl Harbor, however, Ward sank another midget sub at 6:37 a.m. in the first American shots fired in the Pacific Theater. A midget submarine on the north side of Ford Island missed the seaplane tender Curtis with her first torpedo and missed the attacking destroyer Monaghan with her other one before being sunk by Monaghan at 8:43 a.m. A third midget submarine, Ha-19, grounded twice, once outside the harbor entrance and one on the east side of Oahu, where it was captured on December 8th. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki swam ashore and was captured by Hawaii National Guard Corporal David Akui, becoming the first Japanese POW. A fourth had been damaged by a depth charge attack and was abandoned by its crew before it could fire its torpedoes. It was found outside of the harbor in 1960. Japanese forces received a radio message from a midget submarine at 12:41 a.m. on December 8th claiming to have damaged one or more large warships inside Pearl Harbor. There was a 5th midget submarine discovered in 1992, lying in 3 pieces outside Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor took place before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan, but this was not Admiral Yamamoto's intention. He originally stipulated that the attack should not begin until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that peace negotiations were over. However, the attack began before the notice could be delivered. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification, commonly referred to as the 14-part message, in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as ordered, and consequently the message was not presented until more than 1 hour after the attack had begun. The final part of the message is sometimes described as a declaration of war. While it was viewed by a number of senior American government and military officials as a very strong indicator negotiations were likely to be terminated and that war might break out at any moment, it neither declared war nor severed diplomatic relations. The Japanese declaration of war was not delivered to the United States government until the day after the attack. The first wave consisted of 183 planes, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, and it was launched north of Oahu. 6 airplanes failed to launch due to technical difficulties. The first wave included 3 groups. The first group, which targeted battleships and aircraft carriers and consisted of 49 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers armed with 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs, organized in 4 sections with 1 failed to launch. They also had 40 B-5N bombers armed with Type 91 torpedoes, also in 4 sections that launched successfully. Then we have the second group, which targeted Ford Island and Wheeler Field, and consisted of 51 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers armed with 550-pound general-purpose bombs, and 3 failed to launch. And finally, the third group, which targeted the aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, and Kenaway, and consisted of 43 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters for air control and strafing, and 2 failed to launch from this group. As the first wave approached, the United States Army SCR-270 radar positioned at Opana Point near the island's north tip detected them. This post had been in training mode for months, but was not yet operational. The operators, Privates George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockard, reported a target to Private Joseph P. McDonald, a private stationed at Fort Shafter's Intercept Center near Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, a newly assigned officer at the thinly manned Intercept Center, presumed it was the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The Japanese planes were approaching from a direction very similar to that of the bombers, and while the operators had never seen a formation that big on radar, they neglected to report the size of it to Lieutenant Tyler. Tyler, for security reasons, could not tell the operators of the 6 B-17s that were due, even though it was widely known. The first wave approached Oahu and they encountered and shot down several American aircraft. At least one of these radioed a somewhat incoherent warning. Other warnings from ships off the harbor entrance were still being processed or awaiting confirmation when the Japanese air assault began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time with the attack at Kaneohe. A total of 353 Japanese planes reached Oahu in 2 waves. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of surprise to attack the battleships, while dive bombers attacked American air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main United States Army Air Force's fighter base. The 171 planes in the second wave attacked the Army Air Force's Bellows Field near Kaneohe on the windward side of the island and Ford Island. The only aerial opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise. In the first wave attack, about 8 of the 49 armor-piercing bombs dropped hit their intended battleship targets. At least 2 of those bombs broke up on impact, another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and 1 was a dud. 13 of the 40 torpedoes launched hit battleships, while 4 hit other ships. Men aboard the ships woke to the sound of alarms, bombs exploding, and gunfire, prompting them to dress as they ran to general quarters stations. The famous message was sent from the headquarters of Patrol Wing 2, quote, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill." American servicemen were caught unprepared by the attack, and ammunition lockers were locked, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to prevent sabotage, and guns were unmanned. Despite this low alert status, many American personnel sprung into action. Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr., aboard USS Nevada, commanded the ship's anti-aircraft guns and was severely wounded but remained at his post, an American hero. In the captain's absence, Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas commanded Nevada and got her underway until the ship was grounded at 9:10 a.m. One of the destroyers, Aylwin, got underway with only 4 officers aboard, all ensigns, none with more than a year's sea duty. She operated at sea for 36 hours before her commanding officer managed to get back on board. Captain Mervyn Benyon, commanding West Virginia, led his men until he was cut down by shrapnel from a bomb which hit Tennessee, moored next to them. The first wave was devastating, and the second wave was on its way. The second wave consisted of 171 planes, 54 B-5Ns, 81 D-3As, and 36 A-6Ms, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. 4 planes failed to launch because of technical difficulties. The separate sections arrived at the attack point almost simultaneously from different directions. This wave and its targets also had 3 groups of planes as follows. The first group, which consisted of 54 B-5Ns armed with 550-pound and 132-pound general-purpose bombs. 27 of them were to attack the aircraft and hangars on Kaneohe, Ford Island, and Barbers Point. 27 of them were to attack the hangars and aircraft on Hickam Field. Then was the second group, which was targeting the aircraft carriers and cruisers, and it consisted of 78 D-3As armed with 550-pound general-purpose bombs in 4 sections, and 3 aborted. And finally, we have the third group, which targeted the aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barbers Point, and Kaneohe, and it consisted of 35 A-6Ms for defense and strafing, and 1 aborted out of this grouping. Now it is time to get to the part of the episode that will make many sad, angry, and upset. American casualties and damage. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,008 sailors were killed and 710 others were wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen were killed and 364 were wounded. 109 Marines were killed and 69 were wounded. And 68 civilians were killed and 35 wounded. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed and 1,178 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. All of the Americans killed or wounded during the attack were legally non-combatants, given that there was no state of war when the attack occurred, which makes this all the more heinous. Rest in peace to all of those lost during this horrendous attack, and I thank them for their service. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were because of the explosion of Arizona's Forward magazine after she was hit by a modified 16-inch shell. Author Craig Nelson wrote that the vast majority of the U.S. sailors killed at Pearl Harbor were junior enlisted personnel. Quote, "The officers of the Navy all lived in houses, and the junior people were the ones on the boats. So pretty much all of the people who died in the direct line of attack were very junior people. So everyone is about 17 or 18 whose story is told there," Nelson said. "I cannot imagine being a 17 or 18-year-old kid and having my story end there in such a way. Rest in peace to these brave young souls." Among the more notable civilian casualties were 3 of 9 Honolulu Fire Department firefighters who responded to Hickam Field during the bombing in Honolulu, becoming the only fire department members on American soil to be attacked by a foreign power in history. The other 6 were wounded, and they later received Purple Hearts for their peacetime actions that day on June 13, 1944. The 3 who passed did not receive theirs until December 7, 1984, which is a crying shame it took so long. This marks the only non-military firefighters to receive such an award in American history. Nevada was already damaged by a torpedo and a blaze amidships, but she attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway and sustained more hits from 250-pound bombs, which started further fires. She was deliberately beached in order to avoid risking blocking the harbor entrance if she sank there. USS California was struck by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes, and the crew might have kept her afloat, but they were ordered to abandon ship just as they were raising power for the pumps. Burning oil from Arizona and West Virginia drifted down toward her and probably made the situation look far more dangerous than it was. The disarmed target ship USS Utah was struck twice by torpedoes. West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes, the 7th ripping off her rudder. Oklahoma was hit by 4 torpedoes, the last 2 above her belt armor, which caused her to capsize. Maryland was hit by 2 of the converted 16-inch shells, but neither caused serious damage. Though the IJN focused on battleships, they did not ignore other available targets. The light cruiser Helena was torpedoed, and the concussion from the blast capsized the neighboring mine layer, Oglala. 2 destroyers in dry dock, Cassin and Downs, were destroyed when bombs penetrated their fuel bunkers. The leaking fuel caught fire. Flooding the dry dock in an effort to fight fire made the burning oil rise, and both were burned out. Cassin slipped from her keel blocks and rolled against Downs. The light cruiser Raleigh was hit by a torpedo. The light cruiser Honolulu was damaged but remained in service. The repair boat vessel moored alongside Arizona was heavily damaged and beached. The seaplane tender Curtis was also damaged, and the destroyer Shaw was badly damaged when 2 bombs penetrated her forward magazine. In total, 21 American ships were damaged or lost in the attack. All but 3 were repaired and returned to service. Oklahoma was later refloated to be scrapped and capsized while under tow to the mainland in 1947, and Arizona and Utah remain sunken memorials in the harbor to this day. Of the 402 aircraft in Hawaii, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged, 155 of them being on the ground. Almost none were actually ready to take off to defend the base. 8 Army Air Force pilots managed to get airborne during the attack, and 6 were credited with downing at least 1 Japanese aircraft during the attack. Of the 33 consolidated PBY Catalinas in Hawaii, 30 were destroyed, while 3 were on patrol at the time of the attack and returned undamaged. Friendly fire brought down some American planes on top of that, including 4 from an inbound flight from Enterprise. At the time of the attack, 9 civilian aircraft were flying in the vicinity of Pearl Harbor. Of these 9, 3 were shot down. The Japanese did suffer losses as well, so we've got to talk about it. 55 Japanese airmen and 9 submariners were killed in the attack, and 1, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured, like we mentioned earlier. Of Japan's 414 available planes, 350 took part in the raid. 29 were lost, 9 in the first wave and 20 in the second, with another 74 damaged by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Salvage operations would take over after a systematic search for survivors. Around Pearl Harbor, divers from the Navy, the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, and civilian contractors began work on the ships that could be refloated. They patched holes, cleared debris, and pumped water out of the ships. Melvin Storer and other Navy divers worked inside the damaged ships. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched or refloated so that they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl Harbor and on the mainland for extensive repairs. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year, totaling over 20,000 man-hours underwater. Arizona and the target ship Utah were too heavily damaged to be salvaged, and remain where they were sunk, standing as a memorial to those lost. Nevada proved particularly difficult to raise and repair, with 2 men involved in the operation dying after inhaling poisonous gases that had accumulated in the ship's interior. When feasible, armament and equipment were removed from the ships that were too damaged to repair and put to use to improve anti-aircraft defenses of the harbor or installed on other ships. Pearl Harbor's memorials remain a haunting reminder of the ugliness of war, and a testament to American strength and resilience. The day after the attack, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to a joint session of Congress, calling for a formal declaration of war on Japan. Congress obliged just an hour later, and on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, despite the fact that the Tripartite Act did not require it. They'd regret that, much like Japan would. The IJN had caught the United States off guard, and were armed to the teeth with enormous, impressive battleships. One of these battleships, Yamashiro, had a quiet career leading up to an explosive ending, and we get into her full story this Sunday on the next episode of Shipwreck Sunday.